Well, it's such a great pleasure of mine to introduce Thomas Talhelm. Many of you, well, some of you, I have to say, some of you may remember him as an undergraduate quite a few years ago in psych department, where he not only excelled in coursework and everything else, but he got honors degree, honors thesis with highest distinction. It's such an amazing accomplishment. And then he moved on to University of Virginia to study cultural psychology with Shigen Oishi, and obviously he excelled. And he got a degree in 2015, and then today he's an associate professor in behavioral science in University of Chicago Business School. Now, this event represent Thomas's homecoming. Welcome, this is great. After this remarkable 15-year journey, you know, it's a remarkable thing. 15 years ago, it was just a silly one stupid idea. And now it's one of the greatest insights cultural psychology can offer to the field of social and behavioral science at large. So that's a remarkable accomplishment. And we are going to hear some of the latest findings in this line of research. So now looking ahead, we had planned to host Maya Tamir from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. For obvious reason, due to what's happening in that country, we had to cancel her visit. So there's no meeting this coming week. That's unfortunate. But right now, we are working with Rich and Ethan Kress sitting here. I try to bring her back sometimes in the winter time. Hopefully by that time, situation settles in that country. And obviously, she's wonderful, lead of the field on emotion and emotional regulation, and more recently in conjunction with culture. So we really want to bring her back. So I'll keep you posted, so stay tuned. So in any case, for now, we are so excited to have you, Thomas. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Thomas Talhelm.
Use this. Let me know if the volume is not it's not good enough. Hi everybody. I feel like by this point in my career, I'm usually not nervous to give talks, but I feel like this one's making me a little bit more nervous just because it's Michigan and you guys know about culture. Also because like Richard Nesbitt's in the audience. Richard, I don't know if you remember this. So we never talked when I was an undergrad here, and I did the rice theory stuff. And then when that paper came out, I sent you an email and I said, like, hey, here's this paper. I hope you really like it. And then you sent me an email back and you said, that was years ago, but I still remember what you said. You said, like, of course I like it, it's great. And you said, wow, a cover story in science as a grad student. There's only one way to go from here, and that's down. And I think that's right. I haven't had another cover story in science, and I probably won't have another one. But I appreciate it. It meant a lot to me that you said you liked it, and it's like one of those nervous things for me. So made an impression on me. All right. I wanted to, because this is sort of like a homecoming for me, I wanted to tell a little bit more of the story of like how I got there, where the idea came from. So I think that's what I'll start with, and then I'll get into a little bit more of the new findings as soon as I can figure out my clicker. I understand. All right, there we go. Now it's working. I live or die with a clicker. All right, so like Shanoop said, I graduated from the University of Michigan in 2007. When I was here in undergrad, I was a Spanish and a psychology major. And because I was studying Spanish for so many years, I knew I wanted to study abroad. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about studying in Spain or somewhere else. And I started to look into the study abroad programs, and I realized that they were very expensive. Obviously, you have to pay for like airfare and accommodations, but there's also like program fees and stuff on top of that. And I was thinking that maybe there's a better way. And then I found out you could apply for a program to be a research assistant on professors' projects in other cultures abroad. And so if you got accepted, they would not only pay for all of your expenses, but they would pay you on top of that. So I was like, wow, negative to positive, that sounds amazing. I want to do that program. And so I looked through the project book, right? It depends on where people's projects are. And so I was looking through this project book, and I found one that was in Chile. There was another one that was in the Dominican Republic. And so I applied for the program, and I said, send me to one of these two places. I want to go there. And a month later, I got a letter in the mail that said, congratulations, you're going to Beijing. And I was like, oh, okay, well, you're paying the bills. I guess I'm going. I don't usually add this part to the talk, but it was Twyla Tardif, like her project. She's done a lot of research in China. And so I was going to be a research assistant on her project. And she does a lot of research in Beijing. So that's where they were sending me. And in retrospect, it was one of those fortunate accidents. I did not choose to go there, but I found that learning Chinese was really fun. China is a great place to explore if you're interested in psychology and culture. So after I came back to Michigan to finish, I then did a bunch of other things that would send me to China. So I did a program called Princeton in Asia. I asked to go to Beijing, and they sent me to Guangzhou, which is in southern China. I was a freelance journalist in Beijing. I did a Fulbright scholarship when I was in grad school, and I've been at UChicago since 2015. So that's sort of the background. While I was living in China, my inspiration really was from being in these different regions and experiencing life there. This is Guangzhou, the city where I taught high school. That is not a stock photo of a white guy teaching English in China. That's my friend Gus, who taught after me. That's one of the actual classrooms that we taught in. So there's some of our actual students. So that's where I was teaching high school. And as I was teaching high school and living there, I was making sort of mental observations about cultural differences the entire time I was living there. One of the things I would notice is when I would go to the supermarket, the aisles were very narrow. They tended to be very crowded. And I noticed that it was very easy for people to accidentally bump into me, or I bump into other people, or people just kind of get in your space. And I would notice when that would happen, people's response was not to say anything or apologize or do anything like that. Instead, it was to get kind of nervous, look at the floor, and like kind of shuffle away quietly. It seemed to me like, okay, avoiding conflict, like not approach, like that seems to be what's going on here. A few months later, I traveled to northeastern China, to Harbin. Catherine, I know you've been as well. I went there with my roommate David, shown here, performing in China. And we went to a city called Harbin. It's in the northeast. We were at a museum there, and we were talking to somebody who was working at the museum. And she stopped us mid-sentence. And she said, wow, your Chinese is really good. And she said, but your Chinese, and she pointed to me, is better than your Chinese. She pointed to David. And the two of us were just so awkward. David and I are still friends, despite that moment. He actually went to the University of Chicago, got a PhD there. So we both lived in Chicago. We're still friends, but he does not know that I've told this story to hundreds of people around the world. That's how awkward that was. And so it seemed to me like, wait a second, I'm still in China. This seems really different, right? Like from the grocery store where people didn't even seem willing to acknowledge that they've bumped into me, like that sort of nervousness, to the, hey, did you notice that you're better than you, right? Like right to your face, right? Like what's going on here? There seem to be differences within China that I hadn't read about, right? That I didn't understand. And so over several years of living in China, northern China seemed to me sort of more outgoing, more direct, less concerned about that whole sort of harmony thing. Southern China felt more like what I thought China was going to be like before I ever went there. So like shy around strangers, focused on avoiding conflict, that sort of thing. And so I spent several years living in China with this sort of larger idea in my head. Okay, the North and the South, they seem pretty different. But what's going on here? I spent a lot of time just wondering what what could have been the difference that caused this. And when I was a freelance journalist for a year in Beijing, you don't tell the Chinese government that you're going to be a freelance journalist because that's illegal. And so I had to get a visa some other way. And so instead, I signed up to be a student at a university. And I was able to take like Chinese classes or classes with Chinese students. So I was sort of pretending to be an undergrad while I was there to get my visa, where I could then do journalism on the side. My classes ended up being really boring, and so I just would stumble into other classes that were available and then start listening, and I would stay if I found them interesting. And one of them was a class on dialects. And I thought this was fascinating. It's like most parents in China are trying to prevent their children from speaking dialects. They want their kids to speak Mandarin. But here was a class where we were learning about and respecting like the diversity and like the history of dialects in China. And I thought that was fascinating. So I stayed in that one. And I remember one day our professor was telling us about some distinction in Chinese that's not really important. It's just that the word for hand, shou, that can also sometimes mean the whole arm. So in some places it's only hand, in other places it can also refer to the whole arm. And our professor showed us a map of where it can only mean hand or where it can also mean arm. And he put this map up when they were like, I don't know, something like red dots for hand and blue dots for arm. And probably most of the class is like half asleep. He showed us this map, and I don't have that map, and I've never been able to find it, so I don't know if it's a figment of my imagination. But that map was split almost perfectly on the Yangtze River that you see here. North of the Yangtze River, it was hand. South of the Yangtze River was arm. Now, the key is not hand and arm. The key is, to me, where people are speaking the same, there's probably a culture there, right? Here I was looking for the outlines of culture. I had little bits and pieces here and there. But this map was, I think, showing me the full map of that. It was as if Thomas had traveled to hundreds of villages all over China and created a map of where cultures were different. And so while the class moved on and most of my classmates were probably thinking it was really boring, my head was on fire. I was like, my world's changed right in that instant. This thing that I've been thinking about for years is in that map. And I have to figure out what that map is about. And so my head was just going 1,000 miles a minute when I saw that map. And it turns out that, you know, I was thinking about things like, oh, was the Yangtze River like a barrier, right? Like, why is India so different from China? It's like, well, there's mountains in between there, right? So that's why the cultures are so different. Turns out the Yangtze River is more like the Mississippi. You can get across it in a boat super easy. So it's not separating physically people. And it turns out one of the things that does differ along the Yangtze River is where people grow rice. So rice is grown along the river and then farther south. And then if you look at crops like wheat, those are grown in the north. And so I said, maybe that's it. The more that I read about rice and wheat, the anthropological accounts of what it meant to farm rice and wheat, the more it was fitting with things that I was seeing on an everyday basis, right? So why would rice be important for culture? One is it requires irrigation. So paddy rice is built upon irrigation networks, right? Water matters because that means that farmers have to coordinate when they fill and when they drain their fields. We have to work together, okay? It also means that how much water I use affects how much water you can use. And this is what I call functional interdependence. Just people having to coordinate their behavior on an everyday basis just to eat, right? I've discovered this again more recently when I remodeled my apartment in Chicago. We were doing some work in the bathroom, and we had to do the work in the bathroom that we needed to do, we had to shut the water off to every single unit above and below for 30 stories in my building. Water has a way of forcing people to coordinate, right? Because we wanted to accomplish our minor goal, we had to inconvenience the rest of that floor of the, you know, that wing of the building, right? Water has this way of connecting people. Second, rice requires a lot of labor. When anthropologists have visited pre-modern rice villages in China and in other countries, what they find is that rice requires about double the amount of labor per unit of land that wheat does. When you look at that graph, like go back, when you look at that graph, that's a huge difference, right? It would be weird if anthropologists discovered this. Because if your roommate or your brother works an 80-hour-a-week job and you work 40 hours a week, you don't need a scientist to tell you who's working more, right? Like people should have known this, right? And it turns out that if you look at old farming guides, like this one published in the 1600s, they contain sentences like this: if one is short of labor, it's best to grow wheat. Like people knew about this. This was a huge difference in people's everyday lives. People were aware of this, right? That's how big of a difference this was. Why does that matter for culture? Because rice farming villages would create labor exchanges. So people would have to rely on extended family, for example, maybe people from nearby villages, people who didn't normally farm, but they'll help me in the period where I need that extra help. This is also not a stock photo. This is I was traveling in Guangdong province where I taught high school, and I believe that's probably some sort of labor exchange going on, or one very large family of people who are the same age. Okay, at that point you might ask yourself, why would anybody farm rice? It seems like a really bad deal. It's twice the labor, and you have to work with other people. You have to lose your freedom. It seems like a really bad deal. We can get the answer to this question if you look at old records of crops. There's pretty good records of this going back historically because crops were used for things like taxes, right? So governments wanted to know who was growing what and how productive it was. And so one thing we can do is, let's go back to the 1600s. Let's look at European wheat farmers. So people growing wheat in Europe, how productive was that? It was 5 to 1. So for 1 liter of seeds that I put into the ground, at the end of the season, I'll get 5 liters of wheat as food, right? So 5 to 1 ratios, that's the productivity, okay? Let's compare that to rice. And there's a problem, that's a problem because the y-axis is too short. Let me double the y-axis. Oh, it's still too short. Let me triple that original y-axis. That's still not working. This is what you need to do to that y-axis to accommodate the difference in productivity between paddy rice and European wheat farming. That's how different they are. So yeah, it was a huge cost, right? It was a lot more labor. You have these irrigation networks that people had to invest in, and they had to give up their freedom to work with other people. But people aren't idiots, right? It'd be really weird if there was that whole system and no payoff to it, right? Rice is so much more productive than wheat. That's the incentive. That's why rice is the crop, the heritage crop of more than 50% of the world's population. Because of this. Right? All right. So in a nutshell, you guys probably know this already, but the rice theory is basically the idea that irrigation networks of labor demands create more of a need for people to coordinate their labor, and that leads to interdependence. Wheat has less of a need. It often relies on rainfall. People can be more independent from each other, and over time, those cultures become more individualistic. That's it in a nutshell. A few clarifications about the theory. One is it's not about eating rice. Somebody in one of my meetings today mentioned that for sure people tell me this, and it's, yeah, people often say, when you eat rice, it's not about eating rice. It's not about the protein content of rice versus wheat or anything. It's not about gluten. It's just about farming the rice, not eating the rice, okay? Second is, you don't need to have farmed rice personally for this to be the case. Instead, the idea is that rice requires interdependence, and over thousands of years, cultures have different paths. Thomas waves his hands, and then culture comes out the other side. We'll talk a little bit more about what's in that middle box later, but for now, it'll just be handwriting. Okay, so how did I test the rice theory? When I got to Virginia, I had these ideas. I was kind of scared to tell people about it, so I just started plotting in my own office. I remembered some of the things that Shinobu taught me when I was here at Michigan, and I set out to do tests all around China. And what I did is, within my means, I could test college students. They were easy to get. But the nice thing about universities in China is that you often have large national universities that pull people from all over the country. So I could get people who were all the same age, same education level, similar test scores, all that, and then I could give them my tests. And instead of assuming that somebody at Peking University is from Beijing, I asked people where they mainly grew up. And that's where I'm gonna, in most of my studies, that's where I'm gonna divide people into rice and wheat. First thing I did was measure people's cultural thought style. You guys are probably familiar with this idea that individualism is linked to analytic thought. Collectivism is linked to holistic thought. I don't need to tell you guys about that. if this idea is true, that this thought style is more common in the West and this is more common in collectivistic cultures, so individualism, collectivism, we should find more of this thought style in Southern China and more of this thought style in Northern China. That's a simple setup. I measured this using the triad task. So we give people items and they have to choose two to categorize together. Two belong to the same abstract category. So like the mitten and scarf are both items of winter clothing. The hand and the mitten is a relational pairing, holistic pairing. So the hand wears the mitten. So I tested about 1,000 students from around China on this. On the x-axis is the rice in people's home province. The y-axis is relational pairings. And we find more relational pairings among people who grew up in rice provinces. Those are U Chicago students right there. Maybe corn culture, wheat culture. Next thing I did was implicit individualism. I remember this from my days with Shinobu. So I gave people the sociogram task, which you guys have probably heard of. In this task, we measure the size of the circle for how big people draw the self versus how they draw their friends. And then we ask whether people draw a larger self than they draw their friends. If so, we infer that there's sort of greater self-importance there. So we know, so here's an example of sociogram. This is one in China. So here you see some self-inflation. So the self is larger than the average of the friends. We know this from Shinobu's work. So the United States leads the world in self-inflation, the USA.
Mortality is great.
So now we have more data. So we're not number one anymore.
No, not anymore.
Yes, great. It's not Canada, is it? Because I always like to put that Canada when I get an opportunity. UK and Germany kind of in the middle. Japan, the mean there is slightly below zero. Probably not significantly different from zero, but not finding evidence of self-inflation. So I just did the same thing in China. Wheat province is showing self-inflation, rice province is not. If you add the UK from that graph I just showed you, that gives you a sense of the size of the differences. So I'm not saying that wheat provinces in China are the same as Western Europe or the US, but just sort of in that direction is how I want to think about that. We also looked at divorce rates. So here's again rice and then divorce rates. So lower divorce rates in rice areas than in wheat areas. If you break it out to the actual divorce rates, the difference is actually fairly large. So in the wheat areas, it's 15 divorces per 100 marriages, and in the rice area, it's 10 on average. There's also the Northeast. This is where people told me that David's Chinese was bad, and maybe not an accident that that's an outlier. If you remove those three provinces, you still get a significant relationship. All right. Next, I looked at what I call the friend-stranger distinction, and the friend-stranger distinction, I think, is maybe the least intuitive of anything I'm going to show you about this, because when the original paper came out, it used words like collectivism and cooperation, and there was an article that came out about it, and somebody in the comments on Facebook said, "Hey, my parents are from Southern China, and I don't think cooperative is a word I would just use to describe them." Right? And I immediately knew what this guy was talking about. I was like, I totally get that, right? Words like collectivism, words like cooperative, these have feelings with them, right? These have images that we associate with them, right? And that's not the image, even though I use these words, so it's my fault. Even though I use these words, it's giving you the wrong image of what living in the rice village would be like, or what Southern China is like today, okay? I think words like collectivism and cooperative are going to be misleading, okay? They're going to be misleading because they're going to give you images, maybe something like this, right? Like cooperative, those people look really cooperative, right? Look at those big smiles on their faces, right? And actually, if you look closely, so this guy on the left here, this guy's probably a laborer, given the wrench. This guy is probably a farmer, given the farming tool right here, and yet they're on the same team, right? They like each other, right? That's collectivism, right? We have associations and images in our head that are something like this, and that's not what I want you to think about, okay? I think that's the wrong image, okay? You can see that image of collectivism in the scales that Shinobu taught me not to use when I was here in undergrad. The scale, the collectivism scales, they have items in them like, I feel good when I cooperate with others, right? People in rice villages don't like these items, right? People in collectivistic cultures don't agree with these items. You know who like these items? My MBA students at UChicago. They love items like this, right? Americans love to agree with items like this, right? So if this is what we mean by collectivism, then it's going to fail, okay? And I think when that guy commented on the Facebook post, he was thinking I was saying something like this. And I wasn't, or at least I didn't intend to, right? So that's not what I want you to think about when you think about rice villages. Instead, I think the real distinction is between that warm, fuzzy collectivism that I feel good when I cooperate with others, and what I call responsibilism. That's about duties, tight ties, responsibilities, close relationships, okay? The rice village is gonna be on the right over there, okay? So the warm fuzzy is about positive emotions, this sort of utopian socialism where everybody gets along. You gotta be nice to people, you don't compete with people, you share everything, right? Responsibilism is not that. You don't have to be warm and fuzzy, right? It's not about utopian socialism where you love everybody. Instead, it's about close relationships, the people that I know and that I trust, right? It's not about being nice, but it's about being there for people, roles, relationships, and duties, okay? And then competition is not, I think it's just sort of orthogonal to what we're talking about, okay? So this is the image that I want you to have in your mind. And so if you have that image of responsibilism, you could see why I would start to think about something like the friend-stranger distinction, okay? So I'm not expecting rice villages to love everybody. I'm expecting them to make a distinction between the people that are close and the people that are far, okay? So the friend-stranger distinction task works like this. I ask you to imagine going into a business deal with a friend. You find out that that friend was honest. You can use some of your money to reward that friend for their honesty. It sort of gets magically put in their bank account. So you can reward the friend. There's another scenario where you find out your friend is dishonest. You can use your money to punish the friend, okay? Then there are two more scenarios that are exactly the same, except it's a stranger. And what I want to know is, do you treat that stranger differently just because they're not your friend? Okay. Now, previous research has done this in Singapore and the United States. Here's the rewarding for the stranger, and here's the punishing for the stranger. Here's for the friend. Now that's a friend-stranger distinction, right? That's a huge difference. What's the United States like? Well, here we have rewarding and punishing for the stranger. You can start to see that Americans are just kind of in general, we like rewarding more than punishing. And here's the friend right there. You can see a little bit of a friend-stranger distinction there. The friend is treated a little bit better, but not anything like Singapore. Now, this is not my data, this is somebody else's study. But when I saw this study, I fell into the occupational hazard that is my line of research, which is to see rice everywhere, right? Like, I'm starting to see the world like it's maybe rice is there too, right? And so I see that study, I'm like, wait a second, let's think about Singapore. Singapore has a large Chinese population, but the population that's from China in living in Singapore is not a random sample of people from China. 96% of the movement from China to Singapore has been from the rice farming regions of China. It's mostly Guangdong and Fujian, right? So Singapore really is like a rice colony of China, at least among the Chinese population, right? And so I said, well, what if we do that same study, and instead of comparing, just testing people of a rice heritage, we can include the wheat area as well. So that's what I did. That graph's complicated, so I'll just show you this difference right here. I'll take the amount that they reward the friend and subtract the punishment of the friend. And I'll call that loyalty or nepotism, if you want to see it positively or negatively. So here we have loyalty and nepotism on the y-axis, rice farming on the x-axis, and there you go. So higher sort of loyalty or nepotism in the rice areas. All right, so I hope I've left you at least with one idea, which is that collectivism is not about loving everybody. I am not the first person to say this. Many people have said this before me. One person who said it before me was Biggie. Biggie said it best. Biggie said it first. In one of his songs, he says, when I was young, I was just thinking like everybody got along with everybody and everybody's loving everybody. It's not like that. associates and friends are two completely different things, right? That's responsibility. Okay, that's responsibility. Not the first person to say it. All right, at this point, I hope you're wondering, is it really rice? There's a lot of things that differ between northern and southern China. How do we know that it's rice and not something else? If you want to see a bunch of regression tables, you can go into my papers and find that. I presume that that's not the most interesting thing that I can talk to you guys about today. We have regressions that control for population density and all the GDP and all the things that you want to think about. Instead, I want to tackle it from some different angles, different ways that we can get at that question. One is to look at the rice-wheat border across the center of China. So these are provinces where the rice-wheat border, cuts across. So if we look at those provinces, we can look at the prefecture level, where you find a quite a stark distinction between rice farming to wheat farming. So this is the rice-wheat border in Anhui province. Some nearby prefectures grow 80% rice, others are like 2% rice, a very large difference. This is really useful because you can take something like latitude. Let's take latitude and temperature on the y-axis. And so as we move from south to north, this is what happens to temperature across China. And I want you to think about temperature because maybe that's a compound, right? Rice areas are hotter. Maybe there's something else about hotter. I don't know if it's disease or something about society or what. I don't know what it is, but it seems like it might be a compound. Okay. So here's latitude and temperature across China. These are provinces. As you can see, pretty much a straight line. Okay. The farther north you get, the colder you get. Okay. Let's do that same graph, but now let's do rice. So now we're doing latitude and rice. That's different, right? There's that sharp drop right around 32 degrees. Something is changing there. The thing that's changing there is not temperature, like you just saw, it's water. Rice relies critically on water. And so that's really helpful for us if we want to rule out things like temperature, because we can go to that border and we can get nearby areas that differ very sharply in rice and wheat, but not in things like latitude and temperature. And then not in a lot of the other things that would be associated with physical proximity, like contact with herding cultures, like Mongolians, right? Historical rebellions and trade and lots of other things, okay? So let's go back to the rice-wheat border. Here's the holistic thought style differences for all of China that I showed you before. So these are all the provinces, all the wheat provinces, all the rice provinces. On the right hand, what we're going to see is just the differences between the nearby prefectures and the rice-wheat border. Okay, so just the rice-wheat border. There it is again. So if the explanation is something like temperature, contact with herding cultures, it seems hard to explain that. Okay, but let's keep going. Here's a satellite picture of China. You see how in the north it gets brown. You see how it's drier and there's more desert in the north. Do you see a little green patch in the north that's in the dry part? That's what I'm talking about right there. Let's zoom into that. This little green patch is in Ningxia province. It's in northern China. If you zoom into this area, this is the Yellow River. The Yellow River cuts across northern China. And the Yellow River is why this area is green. It's water, right? They have water to farm. Now, there are two farms here. There's one up here, and there's one down here. That one's a rice farm, and that one's a wheat farm. These are 56 kilometers away from each other. So if you get in a car, it's maybe an hour down the road. Okay? These farms were founded in the 1950s. These are state farms. These are farms that were formed by the Chinese government after World War II and the Civil War. So China had a lot of former soldiers. Later it was like intellectual youth that needed to be re-educated. And so they started these state farms, both as sort of like an economic stimulus and also as a way to put people on jobs, okay, and expand the economy. And so starting in the 1950s, the government goes in and puts these farms, starts to create these farms. And the cool thing about these farms for our purposes is that these are mostly done where no farming existed previously. These were done on what was called wasteland. So areas that were not previously farming areas. And that's cool because it's not just continuing the culture that was already here in a village, for example, right? Instead, it's opening up new farmlands and sending new bodies onto these farms, okay? And because this is the Chinese government, people are not given occupational interest questionnaires and asked, where would you like to go, right? People are assigned to these farms, right? And so we have essentially pseudo-random assignment. Here's a person who took part in our study on the, I think this person is from the rice farm. Here's another guy taking part of the study, it's another farmer. We use the picture version, which is of the triad task, which I showed you before. You can see little pictures. These farmers are literate, they can read and write, but we just thought the picture version would be a little bit easier. So we gave them the picture version of the triad task. And here are the percentage of relational pairings among the people on the rice and the wheat farm. So more holistic thought on the rice farm than on the wheat farm. Now, we also looked at self-inflation. We gave them so the classic sociogram is about friends, right? So you and your friends. And 2 or 3 farmers into this, we started noticing, my research assistant I wasn't there because it's distracting to have a white person in your home. But our research assistant noticed that some of the farmers, when doing the sociogram task, had difficulty thinking of who to write. So the task said, write down, your friends. And we noticed that farmers were like, Hung Yao, Hung Yao, Hung Yao. And we realized, wait a second, like friend is not a super relevant category to a farmer, right? If you grew up in a rural village, is friend something that you think about a lot? Maybe not, right? The more that I thought about it, the more that I thought, how bourgeois to think that everybody should be thinking about friends and who's not, right? Friend sort of implies choice and freedom. That person's my friend, that person's not my friend, right? But if you're growing up on a farm here, it's probably not something you're thinking a lot about, right? And so at that point we said, wait a second, maybe we should change it. So we changed it to a family sociogram. So you had bad people draw circles of their family. And we didn't have any issues, nobody had issues coming up with family members. We kept the friend one just to keep it the same as prior research. But yes, the family one, so we did the family one. Doing the family one led to a sort of an interesting side finding. So this right here is an actual sociogram from one of the farmers. And one of my PhD students asked me around this time, he said, is the sociogram confounded with people's size in real life? So like, do people draw taller people as bigger, right? Or maybe really muscular people, are they drawn bigger? And I was like, you know what? And I don't know if you've ever asked this, but I've never asked people to later tell me, how tall is this person, right? And so I have no way of testing that claim, right? It didn't seem right to me, but I couldn't rule it out. But now that we have this family sociogram, well, now maybe we could start to parse that out. So this, like I said, the real sociogram, this is the self right here. This big circle right there is son. That is grandson. And this little circle right there is husband. Doesn't prove it, but I'm guessing the husband's bigger than the grandson, right? But doesn't seem to be more important. So I guess TBD, but it's suggested evidence. So when we did it with the family, the differences were actually slightly larger, perhaps due to the fact that people could actually think of people to draw on the sociogram. We also did the friend-stranger distinction. So here we have a larger friend-stranger distinction on the rice farm than on the wheat farm. Now, this is pretty cool because this is probably the closest I'm ever going to get to a random experiment, right? It's not actually random, but it's probably the closest we're going to get. So I think that's one cool thing about that study. However, if you looked closely at the thought style graph that I showed you before, the differences are fairly small, right? So here are the differences on the same scale. This is just the rice and wheat farm. And then over on the left, I'm going to show you from the college students from all over China that I showed you before, just so that we can get a sense of the relative size. Those differences are 3.5 times larger than people on the rice and wheat farm. So what does that mean? I can't say for sure what that means, but here's what I read into that. What I read into that is this is 70 years of rice farming. it in a way is almost amazing that we would find differences to begin with, right? This is thousands of years of rice and wheat farming, and this is 70 years, right? And also, this rice farm right here is pretty much a rice farm in a sea of wheat, right? This is a little bit of northern China that farms rice that's surrounded by a wheat culture. You could imagine that dilutes a bit of the culture. I would imagine that there's something out there like cultural reverberation that happens, where if I am like this and the people who are around me like this, we sort of reverberate and increase those cultural differences.
Why
So,
is it that relational indicator so high?
Yeah, I think that's education and probably interdependence. So these are college students right there, and then these are farmers. And so I think these people are scoring so relational because number one, the most common educational background here is high school education. And second is we know that thought style is linked to social style. And I think these people are living a much more in an interdependent environment than college students at a major university. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think it's biologically plausible that part of the larger difference in the left is mediated by genetics. Since we know like traits like social conservatism and authoritarianism does have a heritable component, I'm wondering if it's plausible that given the amount of time that there's a slight difference on the left side, that it could be mediated by genetics.
Yeah, genetics probably wouldn't be the first explanation that I give, or if I was listing causes by R squared, like the R squared that I imagine in my mind, genetics probably wouldn't be the first one. But I think it's plausible. I have a paper working with a genetics company in China, like a consumer genetics company. These companies in China, like 23andMe, they will tell you not the percent rice and wheat of your heritage, but your percent north-south. And so people will give you, like, these companies will give you a percentage, like, oh, you're 20% Northern Chinese and you're 80% Southern Chinese. So there do seem to be markers that are associated with that. In the paper, we go a step beyond that and say, does actual rice farming, even controlling for things like latitude and stuff like that, predict particular genetic propensity scores? And we do find differences. One of the differences that's out there is that we found was that rice areas have, so you know the alcohol flush response where people get red when they drink alcohol? That, for example, is more common in the rice areas than the wheat areas. I'm not exactly sure what the explanation there would be, but the idea, I think it's at least proof of concept that there are genetic differences, and that it would be silly to a priori to say there's definitely no genetic differences. But I think that, you know, the rice and wheat farm, I think, effectively demonstrates that you can get these differences without genetics. Yeah.
So on the right, that was the random assignment.
Yeah.
Pseudo random assignment.
Yeah.
Right? So were you able to look at the lineage of the participant? You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So you're able to break that down.
Yeah.
See if that moderates
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about it as a moderate. So we thought of it as a potential confound. And so we we looked into the history. So these state farms both have official histories where we can go look at the histories of the state farms. And of course, they don't try to describe their history as random assignments. So we have to kind of read between the lines. And so in addition to looking into the history, we also just asked the farmers, like, where are your parents from? And what about your grandparents? And so what's your heritage? And the way we looked at that data was to say, if there was purposeful assignment here, like you would think that even if the Chinese government doesn't care what you want, maybe they're like, well, but these people are from rice farming areas, so we should send them to the rice farm, like skills, right? And so if that's the case, we should find more rice heritage on the rice farm. And we don't find that. It is equal on the rice and the wheat farm. There was also a movement there's a sort of a political social movement in, I think, the 60s, the assist Ningxia movement. Ningxia is like remote or poor. And a bunch of people came from Zhejiang province, which is right near Shanghai, so rice area. And so these two farms got an influx of people from this movement, all from the rice area. And yet they were split. We have records for these people. They were split equally between the rice and the wheat farm, which kind of seems wild when you think about people's history and their experience and their skill set. But for our purposes of random assignment, that was nice for us. But it sounds like you're asking a slightly different question, which is, might there be an interaction between this new experience of rice and wheat building off of people's heritage as rice and wheat?
Yeah, trying to think about flexibility and
Yeah.
malleability to different cultural environments,
Mhm.
whether, like, are you getting smaller differences among the people who are flipping cultures
Mhm.
as opposed to people who are just
Yeah,
already from that lineage, and trying to quantify
yeah,
the size of the flexibility effect to some degree.
Yeah.
Because when I look at that, I think that's really interesting that, you said thousands and thousands of years,
Mhm.
right? Is in that graph. There's also been a lot of transformation over that time,
Yeah.
and trying to understand who's becoming, when I moved to Ann Arbor, I'm reminded of how much I've changed. Remember, my mother visits from Brooklyn, like huge differences.
Mhm.
But there's still some connection to that home territory still. That's the origin of the question.
yeah. I like that. My vague memory of that percentage is that it's pretty low, the percentage of people with a rights background, or like heritage. So I don't know if we could run that interaction, but I should look at it. And I think it's interesting. It could also speak to Arnold's question, like maybe there's like genetic propensity that is more able to be revealed in a phenotype and among certain people rather than others. Yeah, I like the question. All right. All right, after I did a bunch of these studies, I started to think, okay, what about the real world? I wanted to go out and do observational studies because my original inspiration was in the wild, right? And so you guys might have heard this one where I went to Starbucks and I would push the chairs together to track how many people would squeeze through the chairs or how many people would move the chairs out of the way. So this is me moving the chairs in Starbucks or pretending to move the chairs in Starbucks. Here's me walking through the chairs. That's how difficult it is to get through my chair trap. And again, in this study, what I'd be doing is like sitting at a nearby table, just tracking how many people move the chairs, how many people move the self, right? And this is based on this idea in cultural psychology, where if you're from a collectivistic culture, you might be more likely to move the self to fit the situation or the environment. If you're from an individualistic culture, more likely to change that to suit me. Okay, so that's the idea. Here it is in the rice areas of China. So we have Shanghai, Guangzhou, where I taught high school. Hong Kong's always an interesting test case because it has that British influence, but it's in the rice area of China. And here it is in northern China. So there's Shanghai and Beijing. When I submitted the study, it got a very positive R&R. But the one thing that they asked me to do, that one of the reviewers asked me to do, is like, it's great that you have this difference in people's actual behavior, but the one thing I really want you to do is give people a survey. Okay, fine. So we reran the study. Ford Looming, my assistant, research assistant, reran the study. It was around Thanksgiving time. He went to another cafe, put the chairs together, waited until people went through the chair trap, and then approached them afterwards and said, like, "Hi, would you like to take a survey?" And then we had studies, like little potential correlates of moving the chair. We tested a few different things. Chair movers tended to think more analytically on the triad task, which is kind of neat. One of the other things we found was people who would just move the chair tended to score higher on items like, when I make plans, I'm almost certain that I can make them work. Call this internal locus of control. My life is determined by things inside of me. My outcomes are determined by me. And they tended to disagree with external items. Items about, like, you shouldn't plan too much because you never know what's going to happen, right? They tended to disagree with those items. And so I think the general, like, what I think chair moving is about is agency. I see it as feeling confident in your assessment of the situation and that you can act on it. That's what I think chair moving is about. And I think you see it a little bit there. That got me to thinking of another social thing that we has been sort of a big story in the last decade, maybe, which is manspreading. Manspreading is the idea that men in public tend to take more space, right? So sitting on the subway, knees splayed out, taking up more space. This has been a pretty big deal. It's gotten a lot of news attention, like magazines and newspapers have written about manspreading. Signs in Spain on public transportation try to discourage people from manspreading. They don't use the word manspreading. They say that says like respect the space of others, but it's inspired by manspreading. I also think manspreading is a more general phenomenon. So if you've ever taken a flight and had that little fight with your seatmate over the armrest, I would say that's also a form of manspreading, right? It's controlling space that could be used by other people, right? It's also, it's not just men. So there was a really neat study of this done at the University of Virginia, which kind of inspired me to get into this, where they looked at people's use of space on campus. And they went to the amphitheater in Charlottesville. And this is where a lot of students will hang out, they'll read, they'll study, chat with other people. And they coded how much space people were taking up in this amphitheater. Now, they weren't interested in rice and wheat, but they were looking at social class. And the idea that they were looking at was that people of higher social class feel entitled to take up more space, lower social class, less space. So here's a picture from their actual study. So they went and like took pictures of it and coded it. I want to focus you in on two observations right there. And if that's a little bit hard to see, let's zoom in a little bit. Love that example, right? So there's two people using the same public space in very different ways. So with a research assistant, we went around China and tested people, and we went back to my old stomping grounds, Starbucks. And so here's a guy in a Starbucks in Shanghai taking up two spaces. So there's a space he's sitting in, and then the bag in the seat across from him. I'll show you on the right side, here's a woman sitting in Starbucks, same Starbucks, just like turn around and like take a few steps this way, and you'll see this woman also with a bag, but not taking up two spaces, right? Now, when we were doing this, we first thought about, should we try to estimate like the number of meters that people are taking up? We just quickly realized that is not feasible. And we certainly are not going to go around with like a tape measure and like, excuse me. And so instead we just decided to code it dichotomously, like, are you taking up this space and that space? That's 1 and 2. Okay. So we're just trying to like any amount of space in that second space is second, right? Is the second space. So for example, here's a guy in a Starbucks in Brooklyn. If you look very carefully, he has a backpack on the table in front of him, but we would code him as taking up 1 space because he's in a seat and his bag's in front of him. So that guy gets coded as 1. A few minutes later, this guy showed up and took up 3 spaces, right? So that guy gets coded as 3, his space, and then the 2 other spaces. So, all right, here's our results. This is Hong Kong. And again, a 1.0 would mean on average, 1 person is taking up 1 seat. So that'd be kind of the baseline there. So there's Hong Kong, here's Guangzhou, where I taught high school, Shanghai, here's Qingdao and Beijing in the north. You find more taking up space in the north than in the south. Now, we looked at a lot of control variables, things like gender and SES, inspired by the other study, and people's physical size, whether they had bags or not, whether they were working, all these things. Also, lots of control variables about the space itself. So like how busy was the store? Is it a nice neighborhood, population density, all those sorts of things, day of the week. We also looked at India. So India, like Alan and I were talking earlier, also has a rice food split. Here, the rice is more sort of in the east and then in the south. We went to, 5 cities around India. So here are the rice areas in India, and there are the wheat areas in India. So not a huge difference, but it's there. After doing all of this, I started to say, okay, now I can't stop. Now we're going to
So Indians seem to occupy more space in general. Indian
I've got
farmers pretty much like
I'll
Chinese wheat.
I'll show you a map later where I put into the analysis all the control variables and every nation, and so we'll be able to compare all of them. Yeah. So I've sort of been arguing that this is somewhat like, since it's agency, in my mind, this is linked to individualism, right? But all we've seen are differences within India and within China. And so I said, well, let's collect data from other cultures that we know vary on individualism and see if they also differ in taking up space. So with research assistants, we spread out around the world to code manspreading in North America, Europe, Russia, Kazakhstan, and then down in Argentina. Here are the 2 sort of classically collectivistic cultures. So this gets to your question, Shinobu. So taking into account all the control variables are about equal. Next, I'll show you the sort of middle countries. So like Spain is considered Western, but it's Southern European, so it's kind of in the middle there. Kazakhstan, Russia is also like kind of, is it individualistic, is it collectivistic, kind of in the middle. So these are the sort of the middle countries right there. And then here are the sort of classically individualistic countries right there. And again, we see America leading the pack, but Canada's not too far behind right there. It makes me feel good. So yeah, seats taken in Starbucks. After all that, I had to wonder, my goal was not to test gender differences in this, but it's called manspreading, so I had to test it. So even controlling for things like how many bags people had and stuff like that, being alone versus other people, here is the manspreading for women and there's for men. So it's not a huge difference, but it seems reliable across cultures. So men take up more space than women. I was a little disappointed about that one. So anyway, picture is here is that to me, I see this as representing something like agency. And the societal conversation has been around gender. I talked about the research on social status, but I want to add culture to that. Now, you might say, manspreading, who cares? It's just a minor annoyance. Why should any of this matter? Well, I had a collaborator who said, wait a second. I wonder if this might work for something more complex like politics and political leadership. And so I was like, okay, well, take a look. So we coded the data on China's central committee members. This is the committees, the highest of the high power in China, political power. Now, there hasn't been a whole lot of these people. I think it's been over 200, roughly, in total, since the founding of modern China after World War II. And we coded the rice wheat heritage of where the people were born, where these committee members were born. And we looked at rice suitability. My collaborator really liked to use wheat suitability, but it's really just the sort of converse of rice. It's like where we don't grow rice, we grow wheat generally. So he coded the results as wheat. So I'll show you the results as wheat. So here on the x-axis, we have wheat suitability, and these are the number of central committee members. And so we find more of China's leadership coming from traditionally wheat farming areas. This is interesting because the wheat areas are actually less populated than the rice areas. So if you're just going based on population, the rice area should be outperforming. Rice is more productive, has a larger population, it should be outperforming, and really it's underperforming. It's the wheat areas that are more represented. Now, those central committee members, there's like 200 some there. If we go down to prefecture leaders, these are like 2,000. So now we get a little bit more data, get a little bit more variation. The interesting thing about prefecture leaders, unlike the United States, being from the area is not a qualification. The government, specifically to try to combat corruption, does not make people prefecture leaders from where they're from. Okay, so instead, it's like you work your way up in the government, and then you get assigned to some prefecture. Okay, so it's not confounded, like the prefecture leader is not likely to have grown up in the area. In fact, they're very unlikely to have grown up in the area, which kind of makes that sort of neat. Instead, being a prefecture leader is more about working your way up in politics. Okay, so we have over 2,000, again, from the founding of modern China. And here again, we find that same pattern. So prefecture leaders are more likely to have been born in wheat prefectures than rice prefectures.
Yeah, so what's happening in Shandong?
Yeah, we don't really know. Shandong, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah, there could be something about maybe there's like a social network there that's been particularly powerful. We definitely know that Chinese politics works on relationships. So there could be something going on there. It's also where Confucius is from, but I don't think that's super relevant there. Yeah.
I think it might be the culture of Shandong in particular. There's a very strong push for everybody to go into government. Like it's
Interesting.
it's a known stereotype for that region.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Do you think that might actually be related to Confucianism?
Maybe I don't know where it came from, but yeah.
I mean, Confucianism does talk about like, being a good, what a good leader is, and what a good, what's like a noble, like the person who's like serving the emperor. So maybe there could be something there. All right. If you're skeptical, I hope you're skeptical. It's a lot of, like I said before, it's a lot of things that differ rice and wheat. One of the things that my students taught me when I was teaching high school in Guangzhou, people in Guangzhou love to say, we don't care about politics here. I'm not interested in politics here. And whenever I would ask them why, they said, it's because we're living in Guangzhou. Like the capital's in Beijing. That's so far, so we don't care, right? It'd sort of be like arguing in the United States. People in California don't care about politics because it's not DC, okay? And so he said, oh, okay, that might be a problem for our analysis because Beijing is in the north, it's the capital, it's also weak. So if distance explains everything, then maybe that's bad, very bad for my hypothesis. So my students, distance to power, stupid. Like obviously that's the explanation. And so if you look, distance to Beijing is significant, predicting that these are prefecture leaders, so we have a little bit more power here. So the farther from Beijing is less likely people are to be represented in leadership, but we remain significant controlling for distance. Another way to tackle this question is you can use what I don't know if I coined this term or somebody else uses this, the donut method. So you basically, the center of the donut is Beijing, and then let's test just the prefectures that are all the same distance from Beijing, but some of those are wheat and some of those are rice, okay? So we do the donut method, here's that donut around China. So we're just sampling the dark prefectures here, okay? So we're holding constant distance, but we're varying rice and wheat. And then we find that wheat is significant. So holding distance constant, wheat is significant. Okay. Are these differences disappearing over time? I think this is a fun sort of theoretical question. I think a lot of the people that I've interacted with, particularly from China, are oftentimes people are willing to go with me on the like, okay, rice and wheat, I'm with you, but like I haven't farmed rice. So maybe that mattered in the past, but it's probably not relevant anymore. Okay. And that's always been interesting to me because that's fundamentally not how I assume culture works. You guys saw my hand waving model before, right? Culture, thousands of years, hand waving, and then the people were born into that culture, right? I tend to see culture as embedded in things like history and ecology. And so my intuition is that these cultures are going to continue even after fewer and fewer people are farming rice. But that's an empirical question, right? We don't know the answer to that. Let me just, I don't have like a final answer on this, but let me show you two suggestive pieces of evidence that I think are sort of fun. One is with my longtime lab manager, we created a province collectivism index. So this is based on earlier works. If you remember the Vandello-Cohen paper in the United States, they look at things like divorce rates. So divorce rates, like I showed you before, higher in individualistic areas, lower in collectivistic areas. Percentage of people living alone, the percentage of nuclear families, which tends to be higher in individualistic cultures, and then the percentage of 3-generation households, so like grandparents, parents, and kids living together. So these would make a province, or these would indicate higher collectivism, and these lower collectivism. So because this uses census data, we can go back in time. Like we can go back and forth in time, right? And so here's that collectivism index in 1990. Now, in 1990, China was a lot poorer than it is now. It was a very different country, much less modernized, much less wealthy, a lot more people farming than now. I think China went below 50% employment in agriculture, I think in the early 2000s. So before the early 2000s, more than 50% of employment was in agriculture. Now it's below 50%. So in between this graph and the next graph that I'm going to show you, China went from majority farming to majority not farming, okay? And so I think if rice wheat differences are disappearing over time, the prediction is clear. These differences should be getting smaller. Now, if you've noticed the correlation that I put up there, it's not even significant, right? So in 1990, rice wheat differences in this bundle of provincial collectivism indicators is not significant. Here it is in, the next one I'm going to show you is 2020. So we're going to zoom forward 30 years in terms of modernization, GDP, and fewer people working in farming, okay? Man, that's weird, right? Can I show it to you again? It's like, I was just doing this morning, right? Man, it just works, right? Something's going, isn't that weird? How are differences getting bigger? How is rice explaining more variation now than it was 30 years ago? That doesn't fit with the intuition, right? So when I think about this, I think about two different theories of wealth and modernization. If you've never thought about this question before, you definitely have. You just didn't think about it consciously. I think we all in our minds, or most of us in our minds, have an implicit theory about what modernization does to culture. I noticed this because I was hiking in southwestern China, and I met two French people who were also hiking, and we started hiking together. We finished our hike and we went to a restaurant. At this restaurant, we started commenting on how you don't tip when you're in China. And they said, oh, in France, we tip a little bit, and you guys in the US, you tip a lot. Like, it's a big thing. Yeah. And then one of the hikers said something like, oh, but China will get that soon. Huh? I thought that was such a weird thought. But I think the implicit theory there was that as cultures modernize, they become more like the West. Or as cultures modernize, they become more like the US or something like that, right? So along with wealth and technology and modernization, they'll become more like us, right? And in this case, oddly enough, that includes tipping. I don't know why that would include tipping, but it's there. The interesting thing about that to me is not the prediction about tipping. I'm not sure that China will start tipping. But the interesting thing is the implicit theory in that person's mind is that we can just take whatever we do here and they're going to be more like us over time, right? And I think that's the theory in most people's heads. That GDP, technology, modernization causes individualism, okay? Now, that's one theory of wealth and modernization. And I call that theory the kryptonite theory. I call it the kryptonite theory because imagine Superman's flying around, having a good time, super strong, can fly. Kryptonite comes along and then he's weak, right? It doesn't matter what's in Superman's head. This has this effect from the outside. So the kryptonite theory is the idea that modernization and wealth leads to individualism, or maybe it's a global monoculture, or whatever you want to say. But that force is outside of us, and the humans are largely passive, right? Put another way, regardless of whether I believe that the sun is going to make me turn red, give me a sunburn, I could believe that that's totally not true. But if I walk outside there, no matter how hard I will myself, if I stand outside there all day in August or June, I'm going to get burned, right? It doesn't matter what I want to believe, right? I think that's the kryptonite theory. And I think that's the idea behind, oh, they'll get tipping soon, right? Doesn't matter what Chinese people want, doesn't matter what was there before. Modernization is going to make them more individualistic or more like the West, right? That effect is reliable, predictable, and unchanging. Should be similar, okay? That's the kryptonite theory. Now, my argument is that this idea is in most people's heads, whether they know it or not, okay? Even if it feels a little foreign to you, it's probably underlying a lot of the intuitions that we have, okay? That's the kryptonite theory. Let me give another version of how modernization might be affecting culture. I want to call this the seed theory. The seed theory is, let's presume some sort of latent difference in values, beliefs, or attitudes. And then GDP or money or technology is the water on top of that seed. And if we're putting that water, those resources on top of that seed, then they're flourishing. They're growing more, right? Think about it, right? Money is not like the sun. Humans decide how they use money. Humans decide how they use technology, right? I bet you have one of these in your pocket. You have one of these? This has a nice little feature on it called FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, right? Now, I've got that tool. I recently learned about a friend of a friend who's from Lebanon but studying in the United States. That guy uses that tool, that technology in his pocket every single day to FaceTime his family. So even though he's in a more individualistic culture where family ties are weaker, he's using that tool to maintain those family bonds in a way that he probably couldn't have done 50 years ago. That guy had studied abroad in the United States 50 years ago, he'd be probably writing letters. And it'd be weeks in between those forms of contact, right? But now he's talking to his family every single day. Guess what? I've also got that tool. I also don't live where my parents live, right? So my dad lives in East Lansing, I live in Chicago. Ask me the last time I used that fancy tool in my pocket to FaceTime my dad. Well, today doesn't count because I stayed at home last night. But it wasn't 2 days ago, and it wasn't a week ago, and it wasn't a month ago, right? I have that same tool in my pocket, but we're using it in different ways, right? And we're using it in ways that are perhaps driving us farther apart based on the things that were in our head to begin with, right? And so despite the fact that we now have the same technology in our pockets, it's driving us farther apart. That's how the seed theory can explain something like those widening rice-wheat differences over time, even though fewer people are farming. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the case. There are, if you look at divorce rates over time, like in China, they're definitely going up, right? Family size is definitely going down as the economy modernizes. Some things do seem to work in line with the kryptonite theory, but some things don't. And at least I want us to be flexible enough to have both models in our head, because I think the kryptonite model is not sufficient. I think we should at least have the other model in our head. I'll just give one more example of that. So with some collaborators at Penn, we analyzed a bunch of data from Weibo. Weibo is like China's Twitter. We looked at a bunch of different like linguistic categories. I'll show you just one of the ones that we looked at. The Luke dictionary has a cognitive process words category. This includes things like analyze, therefore, suppose, or because. And because of the prior holistic analytic distinction, we said maybe we'll find more of these cognitive process words in the wheat areas. Okay, so here's rice, and then there's cognitive process words. We find fewer cognitive process words in the rice areas, more in the wheat areas. So that's just finding the differences on Weibo. But here's a fun thing. So we looked at, I think it was 11 or 13 categories of words that we thought would be different, rice and wheat. These are the regression coefficients, the absolute, so we're not looking at direction here. These are the regression coefficients between rice and wheat. So like, how much does rice predict? And then the red are only people in rural areas, and the blue are only people in urban areas. So if rice-wheat differences are disappearing along with urbanization and modernization and leaving the farm, the differences should be larger in rural areas than in urban areas. But I'll highlight all the ones, it's kind of hard to see, I'll highlight all the ones where the differences are larger among urban areas. So rice-wheat differences are larger among urban areas for these ones. So all but 3. The rice-wheat differences are larger. We're only looking at people in major cities. That's weird, right? But it might make sense in the seed theory, right? These are the people with more resources, more time, more choice, more discretion over how they're spending their time and money. Maybe they're spending their time and money in ways that are reinforcing that seed of the difference that was already there. I don't know, I think that's a fun idea. All right, in the last few minutes that I have left, I want to expand the rice theory a little bit. I call this from kindergarten to undergrad. I'm not ready to give it a PhD yet. Sorry, rice theory, but maybe to the undergrad level. Okay. First, I want to point out that rice is just one part of culture. Sometimes people think that I'm saying that like rice explains everything of culture. Of course, there's so many other historical and ecological variables out there that are worth studying: warfare, herding, government, institutions, disease, all sorts of stuff. Rice is just scratching the surface. So if you're a graduate student out there interested, maybe do something other than rice. Like go look at trading, look at fishing. There's so much other cool stuff out there. This is just one. Okay, so that I would encourage you. Second, the rice theory that I showed you guys before is like cartoonishly simple, right? It's like rice, arrow, collectivism, right? So simple and so basic, right? Clearly reality is more complicated than this, okay? So let's throw that out for a second and make it at least a little bit more complicated, okay? At the very least, we should recognize the role of the environment, right? So the environment produces labor and coordination problems. So if you have the environment that allows you to farm rice or wheat, you now have a labor and coordination problem, right? Labor sharing and coordinating your behavior with interdependence is a solution to that problem. You can unlock the calories of the rice plant if you work with the people around you. That's not the only way to unlock the calories of the rice plant. Here are some other ways that people have unlocked the calories of the rice plant around the world. One, in the United States that we've experienced is slavery. So parts of the southeastern United States have grown rice historically. Places like coastal Georgia, South Carolina, right, Louisiana, have grown rice using slave labor. I don't think that that necessarily leads to the same cultural outcomes as it did in China, right? Different path, maybe different outcome, right? I think that's important. People in Australia, or if you ever fly into Sacramento, so my brother now lives in Sacramento, so I've flown in there a few times. If you ever fly to Sacramento, look out the window before you land, you'll see rice paddies. Cool, huh? There's rice in Northern California? Yeah. Now, those people grow rice in a very different way from rice villages in China. Maybe they're still more interdependent than wheat farmers in the United States, I don't know. But I'm certainly not predicting that they're farming that in the same way, that they're as interdependent as rice farming villages in China. This plane is seeding a rice paddy. You can seed rice paddies by flying a plane over it and dumping the seeds and fly over it. I don't think that leads to as much interdependence as the other way. Okay, so rice really presents a problem, and then we can solve that problem in different ways depending on technology and institutions, right? Let's talk about institutions for a second. This is filling in a little bit of my hand waving from before. One institution that's been really important in China is the family clan system. Family clans emphasize genealogies. They share land among the clan. They help out members. Sometimes they even enforce law. So sometimes in the past, people would go to the clan rather than court to decide legal matters. But clans are not equally distributed around China. Here's a measure of clan activity throughout history. These are like the number of genealogies that have been written in different prefectures. Genealogies are an important part of clan activity. And you can see there's a lot more clan activity in southern China. So here it is if you break out prefectures. That's the percentage of rice in different prefectures, and here's clan activity throughout history. You find more clan activity in rice areas. That to me is helping flesh out sort of a little bit of what the hand waving is in the middle. Institutions surely play at least some role in what's going on there, right? So earlier it was like rice to cultural behaviors. Now we at least have a little bit more information, right? Not a full accounting, but just a little bit more information where we're seeing institutions play a role, okay? If you think about stuff like that, you can think about examples like Japan, which is a super modernized place, rice culture, but much more removed from the history of rice farming than a place like China, right? Japan has a longer history of modernization, urbanization, fewer people working on the farm. I saw a study a few years ago when I was in grad school. Researcher Yamawaki created a collectivism index for similar things that I showed you before, people living alone, divorce rates. And Yamawaki computed collectivism for different prefectures in Japan. So the blue areas are the most collectivistic, the darker areas are less collectivistic. Let me just show you rice for Japan. Huh, kind of neat. Can I do that again? Just kind of speaks for itself, right? If you graph it out, it looks like that. There's rice and the collectivism index right there. Let me talk about one other sort of historical wrinkle with rice farming. It's easy to start papers or like my dissertation with sentences like, China's been farming rice for insert number of thousands of years, right? But that history is so much more complicated when I got into it than when I started. Let's talk a little bit about it. If you go to the history of a place like Jiaxing, which is near Shanghai, right there, in 700 AD, that's not that long ago. If we're talking about like 7,000 years of farming rice, 700 AD is not that long ago, right? But if you look at the system of rice farming around that time, this is what it looked like. People had a lot of land and labor was a scarce resource, okay? So what people were doing is they were saving on the scarce resource, which is labor, by doing things like they would burn the fields at the end of the crop cycle. They would lay their fields fallow. They don't farm them for a year. Okay? They would not transplant, which is something that came around later. They would irrigate the fields naturally rather than with human irrigation systems. And they would still be gathering some calories from wild resources like hunting fish. Okay? But if you go back to that same area 500 years later, it went from this to that. So people got bigger, The land got small, the land didn't really get smaller, but you know, relative to the amount of people, you have more people, less land. And so the farming system changed to something like this. So rather than letting nature irrigate, humans created irrigation systems, and these are people pedaling a machine that moves water from here to here. People were irrigating by foot power, right? That's how much more effort people were putting into this, right? Now land is the scarce resource, not labor. Labor is now more plentiful. Land is less plentiful. And so people were maximizing land productivity by fertilizing, eliminating fallow periods. Didn't be fallow anymore, just keep farming every year. They were transplanting the seedlings. They were irrigating using human power, double, even triple cropping. There are some parts of China that grow 3 rice crops a year. That's amazing. So they went from fallowing to 3 times a year. That's a huge difference. So now we had this slightly more complicated model. Let's add a little bit more with population density, land scarcity, enough stability to have a population that large to begin with. Now we're starting to see a little bit more of the complexity that's really behind it, right? All right, one more thing about rice and wheat. There might be a contradiction in it if you've thought about it for a second. You might say, well, Western Europe farmed wheat and Northern China farmed wheat, so shouldn't they be the same? And yet I explicitly said before that the UK is not the same as Northern China, right? Isn't that a puzzle? Well, you can answer this puzzle with this idea. Not all wheat is equal. We know this because, for example, French missionaries in the 1600s, they came from a wheat farming place in Europe, and then they traveled to another wheat farming part of the world, which is Northern China. And yet they were astonished by what they saw. They were like, just wait a second, these people are farming in a way that we do not farm in France, right? The things they noticed, in Western Europe, they were still regularly fallowing the fields. In Northern China, they were not fallowing anymore. In Western Europe, people were using natural fertilizers. You have a cow walk in the field and the cow poops, and that's your fertilizer. In China, people were doing the fertilization oftentimes by hand. You collect what's called night soil, right? So like human waste, and then you distribute it on the fields. That's a lot more work. Right? Western Europe was primarily single cropping. Parts of Northern China were double cropping, so 2 crops a year, right? So although these are both wheat areas, this is much more intensive than this, right? And so I don't think it's necessarily the label on the door that matters, but it's how you're farming that, right? So that's why Northern China, I think, is very different from Western Europe. Much more intensive. Okay, so what? Why should anybody care about any of this? One, I hope I've convinced you that Han China is not just a single culture, that there's important cultural diversity within Northern China. Second, I talk about how over 50% of the world's population lives in cultures where rice was at least an important staple crop historically. So rice culture represents the cultural heritage of a lot of people around the world. This is not just a story of Southern China. I hope I've given you sort of deep view of culture where historical and ecological things can play out on a subway or in Starbucks in modern China. So if you see people taking up a lot of space in a Starbucks, maybe you start thinking about rice farming, right? Not just men and women. I think that rice offers a tool. So even if you don't care about culture per se, or even if you don't care about China, I think it offers a tool. Alana and I were talking about this before. It was really, you said this before, and you know I was going to say this. The variation in China presents a nice opportunity to test theories that we have of human behavior, right? Here's one. There's a puzzle out there where, so wealthy countries tend to be happier, right? So you take GDP and you take happiness, and they tend to be happier. But all of wealthy East Asia, and then I threw India in there too, is less happy than it should be based on its GDP. Why is East Asia not as happy as it should be, right? It seems weird because those countries are more interdependent, and we know that relationships are very important for happiness. And so if anything, it seems like East Asia should be happier, and yet they're less happy. Maybe one explanation is that interdependence comes with other things like social comparison, which are bad for people's happiness, right? So with a collaborator of mine, we looked at first happiness around China. So we used the World Values Survey. We find that rice areas are less happy than wheat areas. So this is mirroring the sort of East-West finding before, where like more interdependent areas are less happy than they should be. We replicated this with a much larger China family panel study, 15,000 people, rice areas less happy, controlling for everything that you think I'd control for. And then we looked for social comparison by looking at money. And so here's the effect of money, or just differences based on people's income for wheat areas and then rice areas. So money is more important for people's happiness in rice areas than in wheat areas. If people are socially comparing more, they're probably comparing, among other things, money, right? So social comparison might be more important in the rice areas. We're just inferring that though, so I went back to those rice wheat farms that I showed you guys before. I asked people how often they socially compare, and then here's what we find. So more social comparison on the rice farm than the wheat farm that I showed you before. So the point here is that I think this offers a fun tool to get at a question that I've been wondering about for many years, where we can get around those national differences in like language and religion and all that stuff. So giving us insight into larger cultural differences. Finally, I want to talk about that modernization paradox, right, where we have modernization and individualism. That's where I grew up, down the road in East Lansing, Michigan. This is Hong Kong. Which do you think looks more modern and urban? Right? The answer to me is pretty obvious. Yeah, which do you think is more individualistic? Right? If you look at GDP, so here's when Japan beat out Western Europe, or caught up to Western Europe in GDP. Singapore caught up a little bit later. You have wealthy countries in East Asia that have been as wealthy as the West for many decades. And yet these countries are not as individualistic as the West. They're all less individualistic than their GDP would predict. What do all of these cultures have in common? Places like Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan. They're all either rice cultures or they were settled by people from rice cultures. So maybe rice could help explain a little bit of the sort of East Asian paradox, why East Asia's modernization is not looking like it did in the US or Western Europe. Okay. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Aaron, Catherine, and Shinobu for organizing, and everybody who's helped me do many of these studies, and probably even more people that I forgot to put on here. So thank you very much.